So you think I'm just a housewife with no job, huh? I asked, my voice calm but cutting, as Julian laughed at my expense. His friends chuckled, oblivious to the storm quietly brewing behind my eyes. The words came out effortlessly from Julian's lips, his tone dripping with sarcasm as his friends burst into laughter. I could feel their eyes on me, scanning, judging. But the mockery? That wasn't what stung. What hurt was how much he enjoyed belittling me, as though it was a game. It wasn't the first time, but tonight, it felt different. The laughter felt heavier. His friends' mocking smiles, once familiar and tolerable, now felt like daggers. I sat there, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my lips curling into a tight, polite smile. I had learned long ago how to mask the hurt, how to act the part of the dutiful wife. But tonight, something shifted inside me. I wasn't the person who played the role anymore. I had been quiet, waiting for the right moment, for the right time to show him, and everyone else, who I really was. To my beautiful wife, who supports me in everything, Julian continued, raising his glass high. The group clinked their glasses together, but their eyes were fixed on me, waiting for me to say something sweet, something deserving of his praise. They expected me to play my part, to smile and nod and make a joke. But I wasn't playing anymore. He paused, a smirk dancing on his lips. Maybe she should take notes from a real professional, he added, the room erupting into laughter. His eyes sparkled with amusement, but there was something darker in his gaze. He wasn't laughing at a joke, he was laughing at me. The laughter swelled, ringing in my ears. Richard slapped the table so hard that the utensils clattered. Chelsea from HR hid her grin behind her napkin, and Marcus, who had once been on the verge of losing his job due to one of Julian's mistakes, joined in. The laughter that once felt like validation now felt like a reminder of everything I had ignored for so long. The years of patience, of silence, of pretending to be someone I wasn't. But tonight, in front of these people who thought they knew me, I wouldn't break. I wouldn't react. I lifted my glass slowly, the smile on my face unbroken. Relax, dear, I said softly, my voice calm, almost too calm. Jokes are fun. For a moment, the room went silent. Julian blinked, unsure if I was playing along or if I had just said something he wasn't prepared for. But I didn't explain. I didn't have to. That was the moment everything changed. The room had finally realized that silence can be louder than any insult. And for Julian, that silence was just the beginning. Before we continue, please subscribe to support stories of women reclaiming their power. The next morning, Julian was in his usual good mood. The laughter from the night before still echoed in his mind, making him feel invincible. He walked into the kitchen, looking as self-assured as ever. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, but his confidence made the moment feel empty. He didn't know it yet, but that laughter, that mockery, had been the last laugh he'd ever get. I watched him pour himself a cup, his back turned to me as he scrolled through his phone. He was completely unaware of the storm that was slowly brewing in the silence of the previous night. I stood by the window, my thoughts calm but focused. "How'd you sleep?" he asked casually, his eyes still glued to the screen. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us. Then I spoke. "Julian," I said, my voice steady but with an edge he didn't expect. "Do you ever wonder how much of the company you really own?" He looked at me, frowning, clearly confused. "What kind of question is that?" he replied, dismissing my words with the same arrogance that had carried him through the years. I didn't react. I simply walked over to the table, my eyes meeting his. "Because when you say, your company, it sounds like you've forgotten something important." He laughed, brushing me off like he always did. "Sweetheart, you wouldn't understand these things. Business isn't really your area," he said, as though the words meant nothing. But those words, that dismissive tone, sealed his fate. What he didn't realize was that I had been the one making the real decisions all along. The documents I kept hidden in my study held the truth he would never understand until it was too late. I wasn't the silent housewife he thought I was. I was the one who had been quietly building the very empire he now paraded around. While Julian had spent his days charming people and basking in his father's shadow, I had done the work. I had invested, restructured, and taken control of the company he took for granted. The capital to expand operations, it had come from me. The share acquisitions, the board meetings, they had all been my doing. And now, for the first time, the balance of power was shifting. Julian's cocky smile began to fade as he finally started to sense that something was different. I didn't have to say much. I didn't need to explain. The silence between us spoke louder than words ever could. I watched him sip his coffee, still oblivious to the truth. He would have to learn soon. But when he did, it wouldn't be me who had changed. It would be him. When he left for work, he kissed me on the forehead and said, "Don't wait up for me tonight." I smiled faintly, the words coming easily. "Oh, I won't." For the first time, it wasn't a polite response. It wasn't a mere formality. It was a promise. The day after the dinner, Julian walked into his office like a man who owned the world. The air seemed to crackle with his usual arrogance as he greeted the receptionist with a wink and a smile. His office was as immaculate as always, with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided him with a panoramic view of the city, his empire, or so he thought. His steps echoed loudly in the quiet hallway, a stark contrast to the faint, almost imperceptible sound of a foundation cracking underneath. He walked into the conference room where his team was already waiting for the morning meeting. He was still basking in the glow of last night's victory, the mocking laughter ringing in his ears. He sat at the head of the table, as always, his confident posture a stark display of his belief that he was untouchable. His hands rested casually on the table, his fingers drumming in rhythm with his thoughts. The meeting went as usual, with Julian dominating the conversation. He spoke with ease, weaving stories of success and ambition, convincing everyone that he was the driving force behind the company's future. "Gentlemen," he said, a broad smile on his face, "I've got some ideas that'll take us to the next level. My father trusts me completely." But then the CFO, a usually quiet man, cleared his throat and interrupted. "Actually, Mr. Julian, there's been a change." Julian raised an eyebrow. "A change?" The CFO exchanged a glance with the others in the room before sliding a folder across the table toward Julian. The company seal was clearly visible on the front. Julian's smile faltered for a moment. "Ownership," the CFO said quietly. "There's a new majority shareholder." For a brief second, Julian chuckled, assuming it was a joke. But as he opened the folder, the smile disappeared. The legal documents inside were like a slap in the face. There, in black and white, was the truth he had never seen coming: 56% ownership of the company, transferred under a name he knew all too well, my name. His world seemed to stop for a moment as he read the papers, the room falling into a stunned silence. Julian's mind raced, but the words wouldn't come. This must be a mistake," he stammered, his voice breaking. "No mistake, sir," the CFO replied firmly. "The paperwork was finalized months ago. You might want to speak with the owner directly." Julian sat back in his chair, trying to collect himself, but the damage had already been done. He stormed out of the meeting, the sound of his shoes echoing off the marble floor, each step like a thunderclap in the quiet office. He called me immediately, but I didn't answer. The phone rang and rang, but I let it go to voicemail. For the first time, I felt a strange peace. As Julian ranted and raved, I sat in my office. The one he had always thought was just a quiet space where I sat, waiting for him. I had built everything he had taken for granted. The phone buzzed with his desperate attempts to reach me, but I remained silent. When Julian's father finally called, his voice was filled with disbelief. "Did you know about this?" he asked, his voice trembling. I didn't need to say anything. The silence between us spoke volumes. "She kept your company alive, son," his father finally said. "While you were busy celebrating yourself, she was protecting your legacy." Julian didn't respond. For the first time in his life, he had no words left. For 2 days, Julian avoided me. He left early in the morning and came home late at night, the silence between us growing thicker with each passing moment. The laughter that once echoed through our house, the sound of him mocking me in front of his friends, was gone. Instead, there was a heavy silence, one that weighed down on him, one that he could no longer ignore. I knew he was struggling to come to terms with the truth, but he couldn't escape it. The power dynamic had shifted. He had spent years building his empire on manipulation and arrogance, assuming I was the quiet, obedient wife who had no say in anything. But now, he was the one who had been outplayed. On Friday evening, his father arranged another dinner. Same restaurant. Same table. But the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. This time, it wasn't about celebration. It wasn't about toasts or laughter. It was about accountability. We entered Silverstone Grill again, but this time, I could feel Julian's unease. He walked beside me, his posture slightly slumped, the confident swagger he had always carried now replaced with something more hesitant. The usual crowd of his colleagues was there: Richard, Chelsea, Marcus. All the faces that had once laughed at my expense now looked uncertain, not sure which side to stand on. The waiter poured the wine, and I could feel Julian's eyes on me, but not in the way they used to. He wasn't looking at me with disdain or amusement anymore. He was looking at me with questions he was too afraid to ask. As the meal went on, Julian's father cleared his throat. "Julian," he said, his voice calm, but firm, "I think you owe your wife an apology." The room froze. Every pair of eyes turned toward me, and for the first time in years, I could feel the weight of their gaze, not on me as a subject of ridicule, but as someone to be respected. Julian blinked, his lips parting as if he was about to speak, but his father cut him off. "She's the reason this company still exists. She didn't take credit, didn't boast. She just worked. Silently. While you mocked her." I stayed silent for a few moments, letting the weight of his words sink in. This wasn't about a simple apology. It wasn't about Julian admitting his mistakes. It was about a shift in power, a realization that would echo far beyond this dinner. Slowly, I reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope, neatly sealed with the company's insignia on top. I slid it across the table, watching Julian's face fall as he stared at it, unsure of what was coming next. "What is that?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Closure," I said softly. "And clarity." His fingers trembled as he opened the envelope. Inside was a single document, the official termination letter for Julian and his friends, effective immediately, signed by the new chairwoman of the board. Me. He stared at the paper, his breath catching in his throat. "You're firing me?" I smiled faintly, the smile of someone who had been patient for too long. "I'm not firing you, Julian. I'm freeing you from the illusion you built." The room was silent. The clinking of Chelsea's fork against her plate seemed too loud. Richard looked down, pretending to read his menu, and Marcus muttered under his breath, "Wow." Julian sat there, completely speechless. For once, the man who always had something to say had nothing left to defend. I leaned forward, my tone calm, almost gentle. "Do you remember what you said that night? About my biggest achievement being folding laundry?" He swallowed hard, but said nothing. "Well," I continued, "turns out my biggest achievement was teaching a man who thought he owned everything, how quickly it can all disappear." I stood up, adjusting my coat, and looked around the table one last time. Then, turning to Julian, I said the same words that had started it all: "Relax, dear. Jokes are fun." But this time, no one laughed. After that night, Julian never returned to the office. He tried once, walking through the front door like a man who had lost everything. The atmosphere had shifted so dramatically that even the smallest whispers seemed louder than applause ever had. The staff who once revered him now looked at him with pity, some with barely concealed smirks. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic scene. It was as though the world had simply moved on, leaving him behind. For weeks, Julian avoided me, drowning in his own pride and confusion. He tried to reach out, but I didn't respond. He called incessantly, leaving messages that went unanswered. It wasn't about the company anymore, it was about his fragile ego, the realization that everything he thought he had was built on a lie, his control, his power, and that the very woman he mocked was the one who had quietly orchestrated his downfall. I focused on the company. Under my leadership, things changed. What had once been a place of egos and empty promises became something more. I implemented new policies, ones that valued transparency, equal pay, and mentorship for women. I gave the employees a voice, one they didn't know they had until I listened. The company transformed, and so did I. I wasn't just the wife of a successful man anymore. I was the one who held the reins, the one who determined the course. But even as the company thrived, there were moments when I would think of Julian. Not with hatred, but with the kind of quiet reflection that comes from realizing how far I had come. He had made me feel small for so long, but in doing so, he had made me stronger. Then one afternoon, months later, he showed up at my office. He wasn't the arrogant man I had once known. There was something smaller about him now, his shoulders slumped, his once vibrant eyes dimmed with the weight of his own failure. He knocked gently on the door, and I looked up, surprised to see him. "I'm here to return a few papers you asked for," he said softly, his voice lacking its usual sharpness. I didn't respond right away. The silence between us was thick with years of tension, but it was no longer the silence of submission. It was the silence of understanding. "Julian," I said finally, my voice steady but calm, "I never asked you to return anything. But I appreciate your gesture." He hesitated, unsure of what to say next. "Violet," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." I looked at him, and for a moment, I saw the man I had once fallen in love with. Not the one who mocked me, but the one who had shared dreams and laughter with me long ago. But time, as it often does, changes everything. I had moved on, and he was left behind. "I know," I said simply, my gaze never leaving his. "I just hope you've learned the same thing I did." His eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "And what's that?" I smiled faintly, the same smile I had worn the night he mocked me in front of his friends. "That silence isn't surrender. It's strategy." He nodded slowly, a quiet acceptance passing through him. There was no grand apology, no dramatic confession. Just the sound of his footsteps fading down the hall, as if he were walking away from a life he had once known. I sat back in my chair, the weight of the moment settling over me. Power doesn't come from control, but from composure. And in the end, I had taken back what was mine, not through revenge, but through the quiet, calculated grace that had always been my strength. I looked out the window, sipping my coffee, and thought to myself, sometimes, the world notices women only when they raise their voice, but it's the ones who stay silent until the right moment who truly change the game. In the end, women don't just survive. They rise. Quietly. Powerfully. Unrecognizably. If this story of silent power and calculated grace moved you, hit that like button right now. What was your favorite moment? Tell me in the comments. And don't forget, subscribe to Masked Bonds 1 for more emotional, cinematic stories of women reclaiming their power.